The man who taught Little Richard how to rock was a joyfully, flamboyantly gay musician from South Carolina known as Esquerita. And if you're a big Audio Dynamite fan, you might already know part of his story. Welcome back to Yesterqueers. My name's Amanda, and I'm a public historian of queer history. Described as both a madcap powerhouse and an off-kilter genius, Esquerita was one of the wildest musical acts to take the stage in those early years of rock and roll. A native of Greenville, South Carolina, Esquerita was born as Esquire Reeder Jr. on November 20th, 1935, or possibly 38. He grew up surrounded by music. The two sisters who lived next door, Cleo and Virginia Willis, taught him opera, and their mother taught him how to play piano when he was just 5 years old. He performed initially, as many musicians did at the time, at his local Baptist church, but he soon dropped out of high school to tour on both the church and the Chitlin circuits, performing as Professor Esquire Reeder. Reeder met Richard Penniman, Little Richard, at a bus stop in Macon, Georgia, around 1953. Richard was cruising for some company for the evening and was absolutely smitten when the 6'2" Reeder stepped off a bus in front of him. The feeling was apparently mutual, and the two went to Richard's house, where they casually changed the course of rock and roll history. Because not only did Esquire Reeder sit down at Richard Penniman's piano and absolutely blow him away with his interpretation of the Clover's Mint Julep, he also agreed to teach Richard how to play in his style. Little Richard said in later interviews, "He was one of the greatest pianists, and that's including Jerry Lee Lewis, Stevie Wonder, or anybody I've ever heard. I learned a whole lot about phrasing from him. He really taught me a lot." Esquerita also said in interviews that Little Richard didn't use his falsetto voice until he taught Richard how to access it. The two also clearly shared style inspirations, both taking their signature pompadours from Billy Wright and their pancake makeup from the style that was in fashion in gay clubs dotted across the southeastern U.S. in the 1940s and 50s. Their sequins, rhinestones, and capes were a little bit Liberace and a little bit Sunday's finest church clothes. Little Richard's career took off like a rocket shortly after he met Esquerita, but it was his short-lived retirement from music in 1957, after he'd burned up the charts with Tutti Frutti and Good Golly Miss Molly, that gave Esquerita his break. Little Richard was one of the biggest stars in the world, and his decision to leave the music industry to study theology in college left a bombastic, electric gap that the music industry was desperate to fill. Gene Vincent, who was a good friend of Little Richard's, discovered Reeder at Greenville's Owl Club, gave him all of the costumes that Little Richard had left behind when he retired, and introduced Reeder to Capitol Records. It was then that Esquire Reeder settled on the stage name Esquerita, a play not only on his legal name but also on the phrase Esquire Eater and on the word excreter. Esquerita's debut album, which was billed as truly the farthest out man has ever gone, was a little too weird for the American public. DJ and musicologist Charlie Gillett says Esquerita played piano with a speed and staccato attack that echoed Little Richard's style, but the overall sound here in some way conjured a chaotic symphony, as a succession of chords chased each other desperately up the keyboard. The violence that was normally only a promise or a threat in rock and roll was realized in Esquerita's sound. Not a single one of the tracks on his debut album cracked any of the charts, and Capitol soon dropped him, and he drifted on the fringes of the music industry for the rest of his career. He performed and recorded with some of the most outstanding musicians in New Orleans. He was part of an ensemble that Berry Gordy put together. In the 60s, he made, quote, some of the most outstanding music of his career with Idris Muhammad in New York City. He and Jimi Hendrix played backup for Little Richard, and in 1969, he wrote both Dewdrop In and Freedom Blues, both of which Little Richard recorded and released. He had a brief resurgence in the New York City punk scene in the early 80s when Miriam Linna, who's a founding member of the Cramps and of Norton Records, and her friends discovered him playing at a small bar called Tramps and befriended him. Esquerita never reached the level of fame that Little Richard did. Leighton Lee, a guitar player in New Orleans who knew both men, said in an interview to Oxford American, "I think Little Richard copied off him a lot, but Little Richard got to the studio first." Still, Esquerita and Little Richard did remain friends, collaborators, and sometimes rivals for more than 30 years. The same year that Little Richard was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, 1986, Esquerita died of complications relating to AIDS in a Harlem hospital. He's buried in an unmarked grave on Hart Island, New York City's public cemetery. Norton Records released the Vintage Vula, an album of Esquerita's previously unreleased demos, a year after his death. That's it for today. As always, more information, including sources and further reading, is available in the usual place.